It's time for Football at 4 with 97.3 ESPN.com's Andrew DiCecco.
My first allegiance is what will be best for the Philadelphia Eagles and our fans for the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. It's Football at 4.
All right, Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, which dropped yesterday morning at 6 a.m. The new one drops Thursday, and it is brought to you by PropSwap, where America buys and sells sports bets. Go to PropSwap.com or download the PropSwap app today. Find out how at PropSwap.com. Perfect time to PropSwap. The NBA playoffs begin tonight with the play-in games. But this is Football at 4, and Andrew DiCecco is here as we take a look at some Eagles news that came in the last couple of days and some other stuff that's going on around the NFL with Andrew DiCecco here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. What's going on, Andrew?
Hey, Mike, doing well, man.
All right, well, the Eagles did make a trade, and they got a corner, exactly what they needed. Probably not the corner that fans were looking for, though. Josiah Scott's a guy who was a fourth-round pick last year out of Michigan State, and I said to the people, you know, if anybody knows something about Josiah Scott, it's probably Andrew DiCecco. You probably had him scout it well coming out of Michigan State last year.
Yeah, small corner, 5'9", 185, short arms, really built for the slot, which is where he's going to have to play with the Eagles, and he could give Avonte Maddox a run for his money there. It wouldn't surprise me if he came away with that job. Not afraid to stick his nose in there and make a tackle. He's very very scrappy. He's always around the ball. Only played about 80 snaps last season over 6 games for the Jags. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it can't really hurt to bring competition into camp. Nick Sirianni's preached competition, and you know, by all accounts, he's really started to live up to that, and he'll contend for one of those slot jobs, and it maybe moves or cements Zach McPherson to the outside, whereas I think that Josiah might contend more with Maddox and some of those guys in the slot.
Yeah, he's definitely a smaller guy, slot guy. You take a look, they traded Jamison Houston away, who was a similar type of guy, a little bit bigger, though, than Scott was, but he was a fourth-round pick, and a lot of times you see a guy, okay, drafted in the 4th round. Jacksonville, had a different regime there, so they end up making the trade here. But as you mentioned, you would imagine that Scott kind of battles with Maddox for that slot role. I mean, are those comparable? Both drafted 4th round. I think Maddox was a 4th-round guy, but would you say Scott and Maddox are comparable type of players?
I think Maddox is a little bit more compact. I think Maddox has the versatility to play safety, which is kind of what I've said over the last couple of months, that I wasn't sure how married the Eagles were to pigeonholing him into the slot. I view him, and I'm sure the Eagles view him, as more of a positionless type player. He can move around the secondary, and I think that he has value there. Whereas I think that they, as you saw them sniff around the early part of free agency to look for a veteran slot corner. I mean, why do that if you have a young cost-effective option like Avonte Maddox? I think that Scott's going to have more of an opportunity than some think, and when the Eagles really gave up very little to bring him in, so it can't really hurt. Obviously, he got Scott, was a little bit buried on the depth chart in Jacksonville and played very little, so there's not a lot known about him at the pro level.
Right.
But he does have the tools to be one of those match and mirror type corners in the slot.
Yeah, and I guess that's, when you make this kind of trade, and I know it seems like a minor deal, but is this a guy you make this trade, he makes the roster? In other words, is it just, hey, let's just make a trade and see if he makes it, or do they make a trade because they've targeted a player that they like, and he's a guy that you would anticipate making the roster?
Well, that's far from a certainty. Let's not forget that Jamison Houston was probably going to be among the first wave of cuts, I would have to think, given the number of guys that are in front of him. He was a little bit further down the depth chart. And they parted with a 6th-round pick additionally. So, I mean, I think given the lack of bodies, of able-bodied players at the position, I think that he's going to have a better than average chance. He also hasn't proven a lot at the NFL level. So before anyone gets overexcited about the addition, I think that he's going to have to compete for a spot just like anybody else. And like I said, he doesn't have the NFL. He's not an established NFL player. So it has yet to be seen whether or not he has the skills and the traits to hold up
as you
and
said,
withstand the rigors at the professional level.
As you tweeted, Andrew, random, but only the Philadelphia Eagles fan base would talk 10 minutes about the possibly fourth corner because they care that much, and they still need a corner. Bringing in Josiah Scott does not help their corner. I guess one question would be is, do you bring in a guy like Scott in the event that you can't land a corner and then Avonte Maddox goes back to the outside? Is that a scenario, or do you think there's no way they go back with Avonte Maddox on the outside?
Well, that line of thinking would be dangerous because, like I said, we're talking about a player in Josiah Scott that hasn't played more than 80 snaps in his career, which is last season. He played only 6 games. So if you're banking on him winning that slot job and throwing Maddox back on the outside, should you not be able to acquire another corner, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster and malpractice on the Eagles' part. So I don't necessarily think that. I think it's more so that now, there's chatter of whether or not Zach McPherson was an outside or an inside corner. He has the versatility to do both. But now I think that, instead of him having to learn 2 different positions as a rookie and overload him in that regard, I think now you can put him onto the outside. Hey, focus on this area here. We have a couple of guys here that can learn the slot position. We might eventually cross train you, but we don't want to overload you. I mean, that's kind of like the line of thinking that I came away with.
All right, Andrew DiCecco, Football at 4. You got obviously Darius Slay. He's out there. Then there's Avonte Maddox, Craig James, Josiah Scott, McPherson, Michael Jacquet, Kevon Seymour, Lavert Hill, Graylin Arnold, and Nate Meters. I mean, none of those guys are really pushing the pile, right?
Well, none of those guys really move the needle besides Darius Slay, to be honest with you.
Right. I mean, you talk about, I think the one guy who was Kevon Seymour, he was like working for UPS for a couple of years when they found him. Jacquet got blasted in that game against Dallas. You remember that. Other than that, I mean, man, you better hope McPherson is up for the challenge. So this almost screams that they still have their eyes on an outside corner. I mean, that seemingly, Andrew, is I don't want to say the last piece of the puzzle, but it really would be a big step, and I think in people thinking that this team is a much more complete defense.
Yeah, I have to assume there's a contingency plan, Mike, because looking at their cornerback group right now, like I said, outside of Darius Slay, you can make a case that they have the worst cornerback group in football. They just simply can't go into the season with those guys out there. Even if they made strides from last season, it's not going to be enough. Those guys are 4th and 5th corners at best, special teams guys, gunners and things like that. They're not really meant to be trotted out there every single week and take on the second receiver on the other team. That's not really what they're meant to do. And a lot of those guys are fringe players and practice squad players. So I have to think that maybe you'll see a late summer trade. Like I said, perhaps maybe an Andre Dillard. If Jordan Mailata really outshines him, Jack Driscoll takes a big step, maybe Andre Dillard suddenly becomes expendable. And as we know, around the NFL, there's always a shortage of offensive line play around the league. So he could be a guy that kind of gets dangled out there. Obviously, Zach Ertz is still in the mix to be on the move. So they have guys that they could, put out and entice teams in a trade offer. So, I mean, you could also see something like the Ronald Darby trade in 2017.
All right, Andrew, yesterday the Eagles made another interesting signing. Today a trade, yesterday a signing, and they brought in the Washington football team all-time sack leader Ryan Kerrigan. He was terrorized the Eagles, but he's 32 years old. He played in about 40% of the snaps last year. But, Brandon Graham and Kerrigan, I believe, are in the same draft class. They're going to be the same, 32, 33 years old. There might be a year apart draft. But you can make an argument, and a pretty strong one, and probably most people would agree, that Ryan Kerrigan has been a better player than Brandon Graham has been, and yet a lot of people look at Kerrigan like he's at the end of the road, and yet I think people still think Graham can play. What did you think about the move?
Well, I mean, Ryan Kerrigan, if you're an Eagles fan, you have to love the idea of getting him on your side, and he kind of fits that realm of opposing players like like if you look at Major League, Jeff Conine and Cody Ross and those type of guys that were just, Philly killers. And you have Ryan Kerrigan, who was and Larry Fitzgerald, who those guys are Eagles killers. So getting him on the Eagles roster has to help. And I mean, it just kind of drives home my point that they lack a lot of able-bodied guys that are ready to step in and contribute day one at the defensive end spot. They've struggled there for a while. Even if they had brought Vinny Curry back into the fold, I'm not sure how much more, he moves the needle or what he really gives at this stage of his career. But, a guy like Ryan Kerrigan, I do think he has some juice. And as soon as I, got wind of the signing, it struck me as a Chris Long type of signing, adding a veteran in there, a good locker room guy who still has some juice in the tank and can rush the passer. Maybe might give you about six and a half sacks, but you'll take that. I mean, he has he's played in a number of games. He has a ton of experience, and wouldn't surprise me if he sees an uptick in snaps this year.
Yeah, and hey, the guy had 5.5 sacks in limited time, which was I think he. Basically was around the same amount of snaps that like Josh Sweat had and Derek Barnett had, about 45% of snaps, and he was more productive than those guys were. So Brandon
Right.
Graham, Carrigan, Fletcher Cox, Javon Hargrave, you put those four guys on the defensive front together, that could be a pretty interesting pass rush.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, right? I mean, last offseason, you remember that when they brought in Javon Hargrave, it was the best of three defensive tackle trio in football, and it didn't really equate to much on the football field. So, yes, I agree with you. On paper, they have a very deep and versatile pass rush attack now with Ryan Kerrigan in the forward. It really balances everything out. But, again, he struggled with injuries, and there's a lot of question marks across the board there. But I mean, I have to say that they've adequately addressed it, and that's all you can really ask for if you're a fan. And we'll see what happens. I mean, having a strong pass rush is a good counter if you have a weak secondary, which the Eagles do right now. So I mean, I think if you're gonna have a weak secondary, you got to load up on the pass rush, and you're starting to see that happen now.
If you saw Josiah Scott lining up in your secondary, I'm sure Jonathan Gannon said, "You better get me Ryan Kerrigan and anybody else you can find," because when people forget, Andrew, that the Eagles were third in the NFL in sacking the quarterback last year, and they did that without blitzing a lot. And one thing that Carrigan, if Eagles fans know anything, is he's very good at coming off the edge and blitzing and getting to the quarterback. I mean, Lane Johnson, asked no further. He's 13.5 sacks against the Eagles. Eric Wilson's a guy who had 3 sacks from the linebacker position. If anything, it seems they have better blitzers. They have guys who have a little bit more of a history of blitzing and getting to the quarterback.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be more of an attack style, I have to think, and based on the talent and the players that Jonathan Gannon has to work with and that the Eagles have actively looked to acquire, I mean, there's going to be more of like a hybrid look, I have to think, for this defense, and more of applying pressure on the quarterback, getting after them, coming downhill, and you have to love that after seeing the Jim Schwartz defense over the last number of years, where it just seems so passive at inopportune times. And like I said, if you have a really patchwork secondary that you're working with, you absolutely need to load up on the pass rush if you want to have any chance of, winning some games here.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people, and Jim Schwartz, his whole thing was, hey, we'll get this pass rush from up front so we don't have to blitz, and then you're forced to look at 7-8 men in coverage sometimes. And the one problem this team had, which is another problem they still have now, Andrew, is they didn't have healthy corners. I mean, you had Ronald Darby hurt. You had Jalen Mills. He ended up getting hurt. Sidney Jones could never get healthy. So they had better corners, but they were never healthy enough to put a good secondary together. We saw that problem. Now this team is simply, I think we can all agree, they just simply don't have the talent in the secondary to try to say, hey, we're going to cover you with these guys man-to-man in the secondary. So that's going to be a big put it this way. If I'm going to Eagles training camp, Andrew, and I'm watching, my eyes are right on these corners, and I want to see what this battle looks like, because everything else seems to be, I don't know, are you comfortable with the way the rest of this defense looks other than the corners?
I mean, linebacker is going to be marginally improved. I think that I shouldn't say marginally. You have Alex Singleton, who did a nice job impressing the service last season. So we'll see if that can carry over into this year. I like the addition of Eric Wilson. You mentioned his blitzing prowess, and I think that he's a tremendous cover linebacker. But again, let's not get carried away. He's not an all-pro player, but he does. I mean, when you look at what they had to work with last year, it's an immense upgrade. The safety position, they added Anthony Harris there. I'm not quite sure how much how well he runs, but I think that he can defend some of the longer tight ends. I don't know if he's equipped to handle some of these hybrid move tight ends like a Kyle Pitts per se. I don't know if he quite has the range to do that, nor Rodney McLeod in the same vein. But I mean, they have some veterans in the secondary. The corners, to me, are after Darius Slay. They're all pretty much about the same level of the same caliber of player. They really need to upgrade that. And the defensive line, I mean, you have to love what they did there, and adding Ryan Kerrigan. I mean, that was a home run.
Yep, and I agree. The fact that I think the linebacker spot is upgrade with Wilson. And it's going to be interesting what they do with Jannard Avery. Is he a guy that definitely makes the team? I mean, they traded a 4th-round pick to get him. They're moving into linebacker. But I'm looking at it last night. I put the 53-man roster up on the website last night, Andrew. And, I got Wilson, Singleton. Are they keeping Davion Taylor? This is a new regime, new coaching staff, but he was drafted in the 3rd round. I mean, do you look at him as a guy that definitively makes this team?
Well, in the case of Davion Taylor, yes, I would think that he has to make the team. It's year 2. He's a 3rd-round pick. He was incredibly raw last season. He has the traits, the athletic traits, that is. So let's see if he's able to kind of, after having 1 year in the system, he comes back a little bit more polished, refined, takes to Nick Rallis's, who's a new linebacker coach, takes to his coaching, because they really don't, outside of Eric Wilson, they don't have a cover type of linebacker. And when they drafted him, Mike, in the 3rd round, they envisioned him being one of those hybrid type of cover players. So let's see if they can see it through and hang in there and be a little bit more patient with him. But
all right, let me ask you this.
I mean, in the case of Jannard Avery, though, this is now going to be year 3 since he's been here, and we really haven't seen any consistency or the coaches having the willingness to put him out there for a sustained amount of time or week to week. So he's on the fringe. And I think Joe Ostman, Adam reported on the Inside the Birds podcast either last week or the week before that he was transitioning to linebacker. So you're going to have a lot of all of a sudden you have a lot of bodies there, sort of like a logjam. So I don't know how many they're going to keep, maybe 5, possibly 6. So we'll see.
All right, yeah, that's what I was going to say, because T.J. Edwards, I mean, the 5 that I have 5, and I look at Eric Wilson, Alex Singleton as definitely. And then after that, you got Davion Taylor. The only reason you have him making it is because of where he was drafted. Jannard Avery, because they gave up a 4th-round pick to get him. All right, maybe he makes the team. Sean Bradley, who they drafted last year. And then you got T.J. Edwards. So does T.J. Edwards get kind of squeezed out in this situation? Or
no.
Right. So Sean Bradley.
I don't think they have enough talent at that position to afford cutting someone who can play and provide competent snaps and play to relatively at an adequate level. You know what I mean? Like if you're looking at Sean Bradley and you're looking at some of these projects like Jannard Avery, who hasn't played a traditional linebacker. You got Patrick Johnson, who's going to be probably transitioning to the Sam role at the professional level. I mean, these are all projections, and I don't think you can really afford to stash those guys based on ability when you don't know if they can hold up for, a full slate of games, or, they haven't really been tested by some of the tested in coverage for that matter. Yeah. So I think TJ Edwards, he's not the traditional type of linebacker. He's more of an old school rundown linebacker, doesn't run particularly well. But I think that when you're looking at when you're assessing the group, he's someone that's played a lot of snaps for you. So I don't know that you can afford to cut him loose.
I agree. And I agree with you there. I'm just wondering if they go with the whole, hey, we've got 3rd round draft capital in this guy. We drafted Sean Bradley last year, and we like him. And we moved Jannard Avery here, and we traded a 4th round pick to get him. We don't have a spot for you, TJ. Sorry, because realistically, he was an undrafted guy. But I agree with you. I think Edwards is a guy that you probably have to keep. And who's the other guy? Joe Bacci that they got.
Joe Bacci, yeah.
Yep. And he's another guy who's an interesting prospect, but again, he's up against, hey, you drafted Davion Taylor in the 3rd round, and kind of Sean Bradley. So not that they're very good at that spot, but you have some interesting draft capital and some odd things. You have any thought that they might go to a 3-4? Moving all these moving these defensive ends to linebacker. Carrigan's another guy who has played with his hand off the ground.
Right. Yeah. I'm not 100% sold on that. I don't know that they have the personnel up front to necessarily make a full-on switch to that. I think you're starting to see guys like a Jernard Avery make the transition because he's too small, really, to be a defensive end. He's buried on the depth chart. They invested, like you said, draft capital in him.
4th round.
Give him every opportunity. Give him every opportunity to make the roster and try and see if you can, get any kind of, maximize his skill set any way possible. Same thing with Joe Osman. I think that a guy like Teron Jackson has the inside track as maybe a 5th defensive end when you're looking, Joe Osman, they never really stood a chance. So I think that having the versatility, I think if you're thinking like the Eagles, they can play defensive end, and now we're going to try my linebackers, so they have a little versatility there, maybe some special teams upside. So I don't know. We're going to see a lot of competition here, so it's nice to see that for a change.
All right, there you go. A lot of stuff from Eagles camp this week as they bring in Ryan Kerrigan. They trade for Josiah Scott. They also brought Casey Tucker back. How many times has he been here?
At least a half dozen. I feel like he's always like that 52nd or 53rd guy on the roster, and usually is among the first to be released.
All right, and you would imagine he might be one of the first to be released again. There's a lot of competition on that offensive line. Andrew DiCecco, Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, and he, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. All right, Andrew, thanks, pal.
You bet, Mike. Talk to you soon.